So these are going to be the best decks to climb with after the nerfs and buffs, and these are all going to be on the Hype Horizon website, which will be in the link below. Anyway, let's just jump into it. The first one is going to be Quest Hunter. Quest Hunter is just still really strong. Yes, it was nerfed, and the weapon from the stag now does 1 less damage. Over the course of 2 durability, that's 2 less damage, and you're usually going to get 1 to 2 throughout the game, so you could lose up to 3 or 4 damage. But when it comes down to it, the amount of stuff this deck can do is just unrivaled. You're able to kill control decks. You're able to kill board decks with your removal. You're able to beat other aggro decks because you have so much damage you can rush them down. I'm 22-4 with this deck. I have a video on this deck already that talks about how strong it is in the gameplay, and one that's coming out soon where you see me go 22-4 with it. Overall, this deck is just phenomenal. If you want to climb with the deck, I would recommend this one, but I do think it's uninteractive and kind of linear and boring to play. You're really just completing your quest and shooting the opponent in the face, so if you don't necessarily want to play that style, this is definitely not the deck for you. So the next deck on the list is going to be Big Spell Mage. This is a deck that I have personally gone 12-0 with on Hearthstone Replay. It is the second highest win rate deck in the game, and we will be talking about the number 1 deck. And overall, the win condition for this deck just makes more sense to me than Spooky Scary Skeleton Mage. And you can run this deck in a couple of different ways, by the way. You could run a 40 card version to be a little bit more durable. I just don't like that because I want to draw my big spells and my barbaric sorceresses and like the main cards with as much consistency as possible. But if you want to try to survive more against aggro, depending on your matchups, you can. But the win condition for this deck is getting out tons of big dragons and scaling with Magister Dawn Grasp. And that makes a lot more sense to me than Spooky Skeleton Mage, which slowly builds up skeletons to slowly maybe build up to Nathrius, because you're not usually winning with the skeletons anyway, so why not just get rid of those, build a deck that's already worked, throw in Theater to mess up some combos, and win the game. The next deck on this list is going to be Miracle or Tempo Rogue, whatever you want to call it, and the general idea of this deck is simple. You want to try to get as big of a minion off of the graveyard as possible, as big of a weapon as possible off of Necrolord Drekka, and then if that's not enough, get a giant Edwin, draw through your deck, and then win the game with that. There are a couple of different builds for this deck. You could take out the Krakatoa and Scabs to put in some Shadow Steps. Some builds run Sinister Strike for a little bit more burst damage. This is the build that I liked because it was the one that was first used to get to rank 1 legend, and I know works very well. And I like having Krakatoa and Scabs as kind of like late game cards that might be able to help me close stuff out, like clearing a board and getting rid of some taunts, or being able to clear a board and get some weapons and some decent stats out on the board. So overall, this deck makes a lot of sense to me. It's very hard to play though, so if you're new to the game, I definitely wouldn't recommend this one. Just know you want a hard mulligan for tradable cards and Shroud of Concealment and Wild Paw Knoll, so you can draw cards, make Wild Paw Knoll as cheap as possible, as quickly as possible, and then just start comboing off. The next deck on this list is going to be Imp Warlock. Everybody already knows this deck. It's my personal build. There are a lot of other builds you can use. You can use the one with Denathrius to help you close out the game late game, along with Gigafin as a form of removal. Again, there are a lot of things you could do. I just like this one the most because it's pretty cheap. It's the simplest version. You just pump out minions and then close out the game with a Shady Bartender, Imp King Reform, tons of draw, or the Vile Library to pump up a lot of your minions. This is a pretty simple, just like Zoo aggro deck. It's probably the simplest deck so far, other than Quest Hunter, which you do have to do a lot of things on any given turn, so it's kind of complicated. This one, you're just playing minions and pumping them up. Normal, just good old-fashioned Hearthstone. I like this deck a lot. I do think that the nerfs actually hit a little bit harder than I initially thought they were going to hit, and now it has definitely fallen behind 1 or 2 of the decks already. So hopefully you enjoy this deck. It's pretty cheap, it's fairly fun, and if you like building boards and getting giant minions, this is the deck for you. Next is going to be Spooky Scary Skeleton Mage, and I'm going to go over this one quickly because it's very similar to Big Spell Mage, except you don't have big spells, you're on skeletons, but essentially the main win condition is still just going to be Magister and a couple of big late game bombs, but instead of big late game spells, they're minions with Mordresh, Sire Denathrius, Kel'Thuzad, and Magister Dawn Grasp. These are basically going to be your 4 main win conditions. Everything up until that point is just survivability, getting out some skeletons to do some chip damage, and pumping up your hero power with Wildfires and Reckless Apprentice. So the next deck on this list is Beast Druid, and this is the #1 win rate deck from Diamond through Legend right now, but the only reason why it's kind of lower on the tier list is because the sample size just isn't there for me yet. It only recently started to become popular, but the addition of the Crooked Cook has definitely been a huge buff to this deck. You're able to consistently draw an extra card per turn. So that way, if you don't draw composting, you still have a way of drawing 1, 2, maybe even 3 extra cards over the course of this card's lifespan. So overall, the deck basically wants to flood the board, pump them up with Herald of Nature, Pride's Fury, or Sow the Soil, or if you can get something cool off of Planted Evidence, that's cool too. You just build a massive board, pump them up, and just slam your opponent in the face, and they just can't deal with the constant pressure, because again, with all of the draw that this deck now has, every time they wipe your board, you just play a new one. Also, this deck requires no legendary, so this is probably the best budget deck in the game right now. Next on the list is going to be Naga Priest. Naga Priest didn't get any buffs, didn't really get any nerfs, and it's just stayed strong. Overall, it was already a pretty solid deck that people weren't really talking about. It doesn't see that much play because it's kind of boring. You just kind of build 1 or 2 giant minions and slam them in the face as soon as 1 minion is able to stick on the board, which is probably why people don't talk about it that much. But the deck is still really strong. I mean, Hearthstone Replay says it's the 4th strongest deck overall. I've done very well with it. There's some people like No Hands Gamer that have done really well with it on ladder, and there are a couple of different builds that you can run with. But yeah, this deck has proven itself to be super strong. All you have to do is get a Serpent Wig in your opening hand, or a Thrive in the Shadow to draw Serpent Wig as quickly as possible, and then you're basically able to win the game. Especially with the new Cathedral and Pelagos cards, you're able to snowball extremely quickly, and there's not really much your opponent can do about it. The next deck on this list is going to be Quest Priest, and this is a deck that I am a little bit on the fence about, which is why it's down as far as it is. But recently in Top 1000 Legend, it used to be the highest win rate deck in the game. It has fallen to the 2nd place, but it's really strong because it beats Rogue, and it has a lot of removal and healing, so it's able to sometimes deal with those more like board-based decks like Beast Druid, like Imp Warlock, like even Skeleton Mage. You're able to deal with and silence these skeletons really easily, and then eventually you're able to win the game with your quest. The biggest problem that I have with this deck, though, is with everybody running Theater and a decent number of people running Mutanus in like slower decks, your quest reward is vulnerable. So try to complete your quest and have Xyrella in your hand with no less than like 8 cards and a couple of minions in your hand to try to dilute the pool to make sure your reward does not get eaten. Because if it does, you most likely just lose the game. But if you have a large hand, it becomes unlikely they're able to do anything about it. And the only deck that really can reliably stop you is Shaman, because they can reactivate Battle Cries sometimes. But yeah, this deck is actually a lot better than I thought it was going to be. It's slow, so if you like control, it's great. It's got an OTK, so people who like OTKs will love it. It's just a solid deck overall. Next on the list is going to be Meaty's Rank 2 Druid, or just Ramp Druid in general. And the general idea of this deck is to just ramp up, get a big Denathrius, OTK him. You have a lot of survivability. You have Topier, you have Scale of Onyxia, you have Flipper Friends, you have a Silence, you've got cheap early game cards like Thorngrowth Sentries, Natural Causes, as well as a couple of things like Living Roots to try to stay alive early. You got insane draw with Composting and Miracle Growth. Basically, if you hit your ramp and you get 1 draw card, you just win the game. That's basically it. And then you get to your late game combo, or you overwhelm your opponent with a giant Insatiable Devourer, Raid Boss Onyxia, or overwhelm them with 3/3 Whelps off of Topier. This deck just has so many win conditions that as long as you don't get killed in the first couple of turns, you will most likely win. So the next deck on this list is going to be Midrange Shaman, and the nerf to the Snowfall Guardian hit this class a lot harder than I thought it was going to. I genuinely thought that it would be still a very strong class because of all of the disruption. A lot of people run Denathrius. It's like in 40% of decks, it's the most played card. So I was like, okay, against 40% of decks, you got Theater, you got Mutanus, you got Bran, Bolner, the Macaws. You can eat that win condition and win the game off of that, which is still kind of true. But you no longer have that extra win condition of the Snowfall Guardian and making a ton of giant Macaws as well. And it's caused this class's win rate to drop by 3.5%. It used to be at about 53.5%. Now it's at about 50%, so it's been a huge drop. But I do think the disruption is still strong, especially against Druid, which is the top class in the game right now, apparently. You're able to snipe a lot of their win conditions, whether it be, again, Denathrius, Onyxia, Kazakusan, Topier, whatever they happen to be doing. So this deck does still have a place in the meta, it's just a lot weaker. And now on to the last two bonus decks, and the first one is going to be Face Hunter. If you like the style kind of Quest Hunter, but you don't really like the fact that it's super uninteractive, Face Hunter's the deck for you. You still have a decent amount of direct damage, you're still able to play with the Wild Seeds. It's just you also are early game aggressive, so you actually have minions on the board your opponent can interact with. And it means that, one, you can win games faster because you have minions, but two, if your opponent is able to silence or kill off all of your minions effectively, you might end up losing the game. So overall, I do think it's a little bit less consistent than Quest Hunter, but I think it's a lot healthier of a deck in terms of like how it is for the meta. So I would recommend this one personally. The win rate's still like 52%, so it's solid. It's just not as good as Quest Hunter, which is about 54.5%. So the very last deck on this list is going to be Relic Demon Hunter, which is a deck that has not quite proven itself to me, which is why it's still an honorable mention. But I did quite well with this deck, going like 5-2, small sample size, but it felt really good. Having 40 cards in the deck, you're able to run Fell Synergy, so you have a cool late game win condition with Jace. You have Death Rattles, which gives you a decent mid to late game win condition with Deathspeaker Blackthorn, and a good early game package. You're able to scale up Relics, which makes the Artificer way better. Kurtrus is obviously huge, and then not to mention at the end of the game, Denathrius, which is a win condition in most decks. So overall, the deck has insane late game, good survivability. It's got a decent early game package with Fell and Death Rattle, and it's just been going pretty well for me recently. I don't necessarily think you should jump on this deck quite yet, but just know that it has some promise. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.